Hi, everyone. Welcome to the PASSERELLE webinar series. Today, we'll be joined by Dr. Stuart Nicholls, who will be talking about the three R's: recognition, remuneration, and reimbursement of patient partners in research. I'm Rob Van Horn. I'm the operations manager for PASSERELLE, and I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Before we begin, just wanted to do a quick housekeeping note, just to help anyone that whose first language may not be English. So just to kind of help with facilitating and kind of removing any language barriers. So at the bottom of your screen, under the hide captions button. If you click on that, or the hide captions or the captions button, if you click on that, you'll see the ability to turn on translation and to set your speaking language and your caption language. So if your speaking language is French, you can set your caption language to be able to translate so that you can understand what Stuart's saying and have it transcribed in French. And that should help to allow you to kind of follow along the conversation a little easier there. And before we jump into the presentation, I just want to note that PASSERELLE recognizes that our office is located on what is known as Quebec City, on the traditional unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat people, the Innu, the Malisite, the Atikamekw, and the Abenaki people. And in the spirit of respect and reconciliation, we extend our gratitude to these nations for their stewardship of this land. And as many of you are joining from various parts of the country, we also want to take a moment to recognize the lands in which you're joining us from, and let us move forward together by embracing the wisdom of the past to create a better tomorrow. And before we jump into Dr. Nicholls' presentation, just hot off the press, just wanted to throw out there that our next webinar in the series will be taking place on January 28th. And manière will be joining us. She's a scientific collaborator at the Network for Transdisciplinary Research, or TDNet, which is a competence center of the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences. And she'll be joining us to talk about the introduction to TDNet's understanding of transdisciplinary research and three types of knowledge. So we look forward to the next webinar in our series. But let us begin today's webinar. And we extend a big welcome to Dr. Nicholls, and thank you so much for being here. Dr. Nicholls is a scientist in the methodological and implementation program at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute and program lead for the Office for Patient Engagement and Research Activities, or OPRA, since September 2020. And he'll be talking to us today about and his work, advances methods for meaningful and equitable engagement, examining barriers, ethical issues, and best practices that strengthen partnerships between researchers and communities. And so without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Nicholls, to get us acquainted with your webinar talk today.
Well, thank you very much. I will just share my screen. Okay. Are you seeing the slides in full screen mode?
Yes, looks great. Thanks so much.
Excellent. And that's progressed?
It has, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So I just wanted to start by giving our own land acknowledgement from here in Ottawa, where we are located upon the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and where we have the privilege and responsibility to represent and include First Nations, Métis, and Inuit of many backgrounds and from many treaty and non-treaty lands. And to demonstrate respect for Indigenous peoples' contributions and cultures. And so we acknowledge that traditional knowledge and healing developed over countless generations. And we want to acknowledge that the research and experiments that were done to Indigenous peoples in our history will not be repeated. And I think this sort of reflection is really important when we think about patient and community engagement in terms of understanding past traumas, and in the context in which we hope to engage with different individuals and communities. And so to reflect on that as we go forward. So this is the overview of what I hope to talk about today. I'll give a little bit of background about why we want to think about providing recognition, remuneration, and reimbursement for patient partners in research. I'll then talk about some of the guidance that's available and sort of what that says. I'll then talk about some of the work we've done to understand researcher practices. And then I'll give some highlights and sort of thoughts around what I think might be future areas for work and development before ending with some sources of support and assistance that may be helpful. So as with any talk, I'll start with a few definitions and clarifications of terminology as I'll be using them. So you may all be familiar with the language around patient engagement. That's what we have for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, or SPORE. But you may also see in the literature terms like patient and public involvement, or PPI, particularly if you're looking at work from the UK or Europe. You may also see terms such as patient and public involvement and engagement. And if you look at Australia and the region there, you may also see terms like consumer engagement. Now, for the purposes of my presentation here, you can take these as being similar. I'm not going to talk about differences between these, but if I slip between some of these terms, you can take them as being the same thing, which will be about the active and meaningful engagement and collaboration between researchers and patient partners. So again, that's the way CHR describes it. And it's really about that engagement and collaboration in various aspects of research, from governance to priority setting to even dissemination of research. I'll also be using the word patient, and I'll be using it in the context of SPORE, which is a very broad use to mean patients, families, caregivers, and others impacted by a health condition or a healthcare system. But you may also hear me switch between using the term person with lived experience, or PWLE, that's often now used, or people with lived or living experience. And again, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll may switch between those, but you can take them as being the same sort of thing. So here I just want to emphasize that the focus of my talk is going to be about recognizing, remunerating, and reimbursing patient partners in research, people who are working with researchers on research, not about how we compensate or support study participants. And I won't be talking about how we reimburse and financially support patients in clinical care. So really focusing on this partnership aspect. And so I've introduced the 3 R's here. And again, I'll just go through these and reflect on maybe some of the different terminology you may see or hear. So when I talk about reimbursement, I'm talking about the repayment of incurred expenses. It might be parking, travel, such like. When I talk about remuneration, I'm talking about providing something which has a monetary value in exchange for the engagement of the individual or group. So that might be an honoraria, it might be salary, it might be something else. This is often sometimes discussed in the literature in terms of the language around compensation. I'm going to try to stick to remuneration just because in some contexts compensation has a sort of connotation around reimbursement of for harms or some sort of payment in terms of harms accrued, and that's not what we're meaning here. But I may, again, I'll try not to, but I may slip into that language of compensation just because that's what's been used in the literature in some of these studies. And then finally, we can talk about recognition. So that's demonstrating value to an individual or for that patient partnership or engagement. And that can be, again, through various things such as co-authorship or acknowledgement. And in the literature, you may also see this referred to as non-financial compensation. So again, I'm going to try and use recognition to avoid sort of having to differentiate between financial and non-financial compensation. And we may also see talk about tokens of appreciation, such as gifts. My final slide before I really get into the meat and drink is a couple of things that come up in the consultation work that I do with people. And I just wanted to sort of head these off at the start. So yes, remuneration is an eligible cost, certainly for CHR, although obviously I would say check each funding competition for its own unique requirements and eligibility. However, it does come with issues in such as this being taxable income potentially. Yes, patients or people with lived experience can be co-authors on manuscripts and co-present conferences. Again, that's something that often comes up in conversation, and no, reimbursement is not income. So back to the agenda. Why do we talk about and want to provide recognition, remuneration, and reimbursement for patient partners in research? Well, there's a number of rationales, and so I've only pointed to a couple of papers here, but some of the arguments you might see relate to things like equity. So other team members are paid as researchers, paid as members of the team to deliver on a project. And so having a patient partner who's supposed to be a member of the team not paid or not supported in the same way creates an inequity in terms of people delivering the same on the same activities, but sort of recognized in different ways. And that's even the case where researchers may, or clinical researchers may at least not be out of pocket for their research contributions. So it could be recognition or it could be remuneration. We can also use these as a way of respecting vulnerability, recognizing that our patient partners share experiences which may be traumatic. And so it can be a way of sort of demonstrating the appreciation and recognizing that. It can also be a way of recognizing commitment. So our partners in research may be juggling work, home, medical commitments, but they may also be giving up a substantial amount of time to support research. So again, it's a way of demonstrating that we see this commitment, we recognize it, and we thank them for it. And then finally, we may have more practical reasons, like simply barrier removal, actually providing remuneration, reimbursement, that can actually allow people to give time to research that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to give. And that could be time from work, could be paying for care, or even accessibility technologies that allow them and support them to be included as partners in research. This is some work from a survey by Julia Abelson's group at McMaster. And again, they asked over 600 patient partners about their experiences. And these are an analysis of the open text comments that those individuals gave around their rationales around the acceptance or not of compensation. And you'll see these sort of map onto that discussion on the previous slide. So one rationale is around their roles. So I'm part of the team, I'm providing expert advice, input, and therefore it's appropriate to recognize me as such. Others who may not want financial compensation or remuneration maybe sort of refer to a volunteer type role. Others talk about acknowledgement, the fact that this acknowledging the contribution that the individual is making. And then you can see those, again, equitable and instrumental kind of roles outlined. So again, very similar to what's outlined in the literature. And I mentioned those instrumental barriers, the financial barriers. I just wanted to sort of pick up on some specific data that came out of that survey. So in those 600 respondents, you'll see that 12% indicated they were receiving some sort of disability or income replacement benefits, and 43% of the individuals responding were retired. So they're on some sort of fixed, usually fixed sort of income or limited income. And of those respondents, almost a quarter indicated that there were financial costs of being a patient partner, and that was a barrier. So again, recognizing that these are barriers to people taking part, if we can break down those barriers, we may get more or better or different engagement in our work. And I'm just pointing to some of the demographics here because this is in a group. These are the barriers and challenges identified in a group that are largely well-educated, higher income, and have a majority that are retired, so have more time available and aren't working. So again, thinking about, well, what are the additional barriers outside of this population, and why might this be important when we think about inclusion and equity and diversity? I'll finally just sort of talk a little bit about recognition, because this is a topic that's getting a bit more traction in the literature, and there's a lot more discussion around this. And that's around particularly patient co-authorship, so having patient partners as co-authors on academic manuscripts. A study by a colleague at the Ottawa Heart Institute, Kelly Kobe, found when they surveyed editors-in-chief, almost a third of them indicated they didn't think it was appropriate for patients to be co-authors. And so this sort of points to some attitudinal barriers that remain, but we also have a number of practical challenges, such as simply awareness that authorship might be an option, but also then some of the requirements that come with that. Things like the submission portals and requirements for affiliations, but also things like timing in terms of being given 24 hours to review proofs and those sorts of things. So I think there's, again, more work to be done here, particularly as we explore how can we facilitate patient co-authorship. So that's a little bit of background setting in terms of sort of why this is an issue and why we want to talk about this. So what do we actually have available in terms of guidance? And the short answer is there's lots. This is just a smattering of different organizations that have their own guidance or guidelines to support remuneration and recognition and reimbursement of patient partners in research, not broadly, but just in research. And you'll see that this isn't just Canadian, it's international. And so we wanted to understand this landscape a bit better. And so we had a master's student, Grace Fox, who led this work where we undertook a scoping review of available guidance documents. And we looked at recent guidance documents where we looked from the turn of the century through to 2021, which was the date where we conducted the survey. And you'll see that we found 65 guidance documents around this topic. And of those, over half of them were Canadian. Most of them were relatively new. 40% were published in the final year before our cutoff date. And they came from a range of sources, but you'll see here that research networks were almost half, government agencies were another quarter, and then health or academic institutions were almost another quarter. So really sort of driven by a sort of top-down approach, if you will. And when we looked at these guidance documents, we looked at what the proposed, whether they mention any sort of benefits and challenges, given what we saw in the literature about the rationales. And you'll see that these largely map across to what I already talked about in terms of those rationales. So the financial compensation can support the inclusion of diverse perspectives. It can be a tangible method of appreciation. Addresses power imbalances potentially, and can support long-term commitment. There are also some challenges noted. So again, those sorts of implications for local processes that maybe don't help the situation, impact on taxation or other sorts of income support. And then finally, this piece that was noted here in a couple of documents around whether this creates a challenge for the autonomy of patients or the independence of patient partners if they're being paid by a group or an institution. Does that somehow impinge on their freedom to be potentially critical, for example, or so forth? So that was raised as another challenge. When we look across the documents at the sort of types of recognition options that are explicitly mentioned, we see a whole range of different things that are covered, from service or training opportunities. And that was actually, when we look across all the 65 documents, that was actually the most common. But it included things as diverse as providing meals, gift cards, acknowledgement on research outputs, simply having a verbal thanks, making in-kind donations, giving gifts, offering opportunity to present at conferences or co-authorship. And then more limited ones were things like honorary appointments, which might be a mechanism to get access to things like libraries or other resources, and also co-investigator or co-applicant on a grant. When we looked at the forms of remuneration that were explicitly discussed, there was a sort of more limited range of options, and this included honoraria, which was more of a sort of one-time kind of payment situation, a gift card, but where this was tied to some sort of calculation of hours. So again, it was based on their contribution and then the amount awarded related to that. So formally a salary, a stipend, which again, like an honorary, is a sort of fixed account, but could be a fixed amount, but could be recurring. And then in a number of documents, they mentioned remuneration, but didn't specify any particular details. We also looked at the documents for sort of other things to consider, and we noted in 22 documents there was reference to other more implementation or practical issues to consider. And these sort of covered both researcher level considerations and then more system level considerations. So things like recognizing that patient partners can refuse financial compensation or remuneration completely, or choose to accept less than what's offered. Again, the point here is that it was an offer, not a requirement. Again, also having one-on-one meetings, so recognizing that individuals might not want to discuss financial remuneration in front of other people. They may have specific things they want to talk about. So again, doing this as an individual one-on-one conversation. Recognizing that the payment frequency, the amount, the method may all be subject to patient partner preferences. And again, this goes with those previous two points about that one-on-one individual personalization of the offer. The next point was similar to already been raised about impact on other sources of income, whether it's benefits or income support. Explicitly noted were things like T4s being issued when certain amounts of income are reached, and that may have consequences in terms of things like providing a social insurance number to a research institution, which people may not be comfortable with, and so forth. And then there were some other pieces that were more focused on the research, so making sure to budget adequately for remuneration, inconsistencies, or making sure that remuneration rates are consistent within an institution, and that may point to the need for policy and whether that exists, whether this is more formalized in things like contracts or terms of reference, and then also having researchers actually understand their institutional processes and procedures around remuneration. The documents also mentioned reimbursement. So again, the fact that it wasn't mentioned doesn't mean it wasn't considered, but the majority of documents actually considered reimbursement, and they talked about examples such as, again, costs incurred for conference attendance, childcare or elder care, as well as other costs for support such as auditory or mobility support. So again, something slightly different to previously acknowledged. So that sort of gives you a bit of an overview of the guidance that's out there and the work we did there. So the next piece was to say, well, what are actually the practices that researchers are doing as far as we know? And again, so we undertook a number of studies to try and explore what the researcher practices were. And as part of Grace's thesis, one of the first things we did was we actually looked at what was written in the literature, the academic literature. And so because of the context and the scope of doing this within a master's thesis, as well as trying to find a feasible way forward, we actually did what's called a forward citation analysis of the guidance for reporting the involvement of patients and public, or GRIP reporting guidelines. So there's two reporting guidelines, GRIP 1 and GRIP 2, which is the updated version. And this would give us a highly specific search, which we felt would give us those publications that were at the forefront of thinking about patient engagement in research, given that they were adopting best practices with reporting. And so we did the forward citation analysis, which again was conducted towards the end of 2021. And we included any studies that cited those reporting guidelines and included patient partners. So we excluded things that were just talking about remuneration or patient engagement more generally and didn't actually have empirical work with patient partners. And so we extracted information about the manuscript, as well as the funding for the work, and then also things like remuneration amounts and other forms of recognition. And this is just a general overview. So we found 316 articles that were included in the study. And this just gives you a general sense of sort of where it was reported that patients were being engaged. So you'll see study design, dissemination results, data analysis were sort of the more common ones, whereas involvement in the sort of research ethics application, ethics review, even things like priority setting were much less commonly reported. And when we looked at the reporting of recognition in these articles, again, over 300 articles, we found that 65% reported some sort of acknowledgement, so reported patient engagement in the acknowledgement section. Almost half reported co-authorship on the manuscript. And then we have a drop to about just under or just over a fifth that were mentioned reimbursement of expenses, as well as, again, some of those other options that were outlined in the guidance documents. When we look at reporting of remuneration, we see that the numbers really sort of drop off. Less than 20% talked about honoraria or a stipend, 4% mentioned sort of gift cards that were provided, 1% provided salary, and less than 1% reported scholarship. In 6%, there was mention of remuneration, but no details given. But recognition and remuneration are actually not reporting requirements. So it's not a requirement of that GRIP reporting guideline. So we may hypothesize that there's under-reporting of this in manuscripts, even though it's happening. And to sort of back this idea up, we actually did some work previously where we looked at a cohort of reports around pragmatic clinical trials, and then we surveyed the corresponding authors, and we asked them about their patient and public involvement or patient engagement. And what we found is, from our survey results, about 75% of those who in their survey said they'd had patient engagement. We didn't actually see that in the trial manuscript. So we know there's under-reporting of actually what's happening. So we wondered whether that was the same for reimbursement and recognition and remuneration. And so in that same cohort of trial authors, we actually asked them about whether they'd recognized their patient and public involvement partners, as we called them here, in authorship of manuscripts or other sort of trial materials, whether they provided financial remuneration for patient partners, and whether they reimbursed them for out-of-pocket expenses. But we also actually looked at the combination of practices in this work. So we looked at whether people were doing just one or the other, or whether they were actually adopting all practices. And this will be forthcoming in research involvement and engagement. I was hoping it'd be published by the time the talk came around, but it hasn't yet been done, although we have finalized the proofs. So hopefully it'll be out soon. And here are the results. And you'll see that only in about 20% of studies did they say that the patient partners were named as individual co-authors, although another 6% noted they were included in group authorship. And just over half noted that they were named in an acknowledgement section. Notably here, I just want to point out the 12% that said that patients or public partners elected not to be acknowledged. And again, this just goes back to that first point on the previous slides, where we were saying these are offers of recognition, of remuneration, and actually should be driven by the patient partner preferences in terms of whether they want to be acknowledged, whether they want to be recognized, and so forth. And it has to be part of that conversation. So clearly there were a number of patient partners who were opting out here. The researchers reported, or 44% of the respondents to the survey reported that they provided remuneration at some point or to some degree, which again is higher than we see reported in the manuscripts. And then finally, with reimbursement, almost 2/3 indicated that they always or sometimes provided reimbursement. But again, I just wanted to note here that the 12% noted that there were no expenses, and that was why there was no reimbursement of expenses. And these were in responses to the particular trial that we identified. When we looked at the three different practices, we see that 30% of survey respondents who answered all the questions indicated that they provided all three options: recognition, remuneration, and reimbursement. But you'll see that those options that include reimbursement seem to be more popular or more common. And disappointingly, perhaps, that 15% of the survey respondents said they didn't offer any of the options. Now, we don't know the context or the reason for this, but on the face of it, it seems like there should at least be some sort of recognition of patient partners here. We need to dig more into sort of what the reasons were, what the challenges were, and so forth. So that was our survey of the trialists. And again, they were an unselected group in terms of their experience with patient partners. We had to find them through the survey in terms of those who identified as having patient partners. And so it was a subgroup there. But we also surveyed those authors that we identified in our systematic review to ask them about their practices around remuneration and recognition. And this manuscript's currently in preparation. So we took those 316 published studies and we identified unique corresponding authors, and we sent out an online survey to them. This was deliberately brief to try, given this was an unsolicited kind of survey on a topic that wasn't really the focus of their research. So again, we can talk about the challenges and benefits there. But there were 256 email invitations delivered, and we had almost 100 respondents to the survey. The majority were women, and about a third of respondents were mid-career researchers. So we asked them about their stated practices. So we asked them to think about their recent work of collaborating with patients as partners, and asked them which of the options they'd offered to their patient partners. Again, they could select more than one. And again, we see here that co-authorship, reimbursement, and acknowledgement are the most common. Interestingly, attendance at a conference was also now about 2/3 of individuals. And similarly, just under 2/3 also noted they provided some sort of remuneration through honorary check or cash. Overall, about 80% of respondents indicated some sort of remuneration given using those options that we've identified in the guidelines. In this case, though, we also asked the researchers about their attitudes towards compensation, financial compensation, so remuneration, as well as their perceived ability to actually provide this. And you'll see on the right with the strongly disagree to strongly agree scale that it seems to be generally that there was a positive attitude to this. There might be a sort of smaller group that have a disinclination to provide compensation, but we see lower levels of perceived beliefs in their capabilities. So it seems to be this slight difference here between feeling this is the right thing to do, that they should be doing this, they hope to do it, and then their perceived ability to actually follow through on providing compensation. And so, in summary, recognition through authorship acknowledgement seems to be quite common, as is reimbursement. Again, we see some instances where this isn't happening. Remuneration is generally less common, and there are some variations in approaches. But we generally see consistent patterns in terms of publications and surveys, in terms of recognition being more common than remuneration. But some of this raises questions about whether this is less attitudinal and more about the sort of practicalities of actually how do we reimburse or recognize our patient partners, as opposed to people not wanting to do this. And so this made us look at the challenges to remuneration and recognition and reimbursement, and trying to identify what those challenges are. So again, going back to our systematic review of the reported practices in those 316 manuscripts, we extracted any explicit information about reported benefits and challenges to remuneration, and also what were some of the barriers and enablers to actually being able to do this. And again, you'll see those benefits and challenges map across to what we've already discussed. But you'll see here that some of the barriers were budget constraints, or just simply not having funding, a lack of institutional policy or guidance document. Now that's interesting, given that we know there were we found 65 different guidance documents out there. So it's interesting to see that as raised as a challenge. And also failing to consider the cost of patient engagement, the study design or funding base. So people were just not thinking about building this in. And now, obviously, the counter is sort of some of the enablers there. When we asked in the survey, the follow-up survey that we did with the same authors about those challenges as well as other challenges, and we see broadly sort of two larger groupings. One is sort of the institutional or structural challenges, and then one which is sort of coalesces around information and knowledge and education. So again, you'll see things like limited project budget, institutional barriers, etc. in the blue columns. Interestingly, limited budget may be addressed if people have been thinking about that in their application. But then in the red columns, I've highlighted things that were more around education, knowledge, awareness, those sorts of things. So limited guidance on how to compensate, so not really knowing how to do it, not aware of patient partner compensation, and then also discomfort in actually talking to patient partners about money. This was also another study we did where we interviewed awardees from the Ontario Sports Support Unit Impact Awards. We talked to different people involved, and we weren't specifically asking them about remuneration or recognition, but as part of the interviews about their experience of working with patient partners, because that was mandated as part of this, the funding requirements, a key theme came out about recognition, and particularly remuneration, sorry. And again, when we look at the quotes around this, it seems to be not that they're have a negative disposition, but rather it's that practicalities again that tends to come through. So the first quote is again recognizing that we need to sort of have mechanisms that facilitate participation as patient partners, but how do we do it? They didn't include it in the budget. So again, thinking about it in terms of budgeting for it, being aware of it as an issue. The second quote is again very practical. What's the amounts we should use? How do we do this? People still working that out. And then similarly in the final piece, how do we make sure that people are being compensated and recognized in a way that's appropriate? So again, very much on those sort of how do we do this rather than saying, I don't think we should. And so this led us into further work where we felt we really wanted to sort of expand on some of this and really drill down on what these challenges are, but also think about, well, what are the ones that we can address more immediately and what are the ones that are maybe bigger issues that we need to tackle longer term? And so we were fortunate to get a CHR planning grant to support this work. And we brought together a range of different interest holders to develop those partnerships and try and develop a group of people to move this agenda forward and sort of really work on this and build those relationships to share information, but also then move forward in terms of research as well. And what we did was we wanted, as I say, identify those high priority topics that would be easy to address, but also topics that would be important, but maybe to require more resources and could be part of future research applications. And I don't have time to go through this in great detail, but I just want to say this was really an integrated knowledge translation approach in which we had patient partners, institutions, other interest holders at the grant stage, and then built in at every stage through. So we had these virtual round tables where we talked about the topic. We then had a Delphi process to try and identify challenges and prioritize them. And we also had the group weigh in on these at different stages. Importantly, we went beyond what we see in the literature, which is largely the patient perspective, the researcher perspective, and we tried to bring in those other perspectives, given what we saw in terms of those institutional barriers that were raised. So we brought in organizations and institutions that support patient-oriented research. We brought in financial experts and people involved in actually processing payments. We brought in legal experts who might be engaged in terms of contracts or those sorts of things. And we brought in HR and administrative professionals, given that some of the options might include honoraria, salary, and sort of thinking about people working in some sort of formal capacity. And so the first round of the Delphi was generating a list of potential challenges and questions. And we broke this down into those key domains. So we asked about challenges when it comes to financial compensation, as we called it here, or remuneration, as I've been talking about, non-financial compensation or other forms of recognition, reimbursement. And then we asked people to sort of talk about any solutions they already identified, because if we already have solutions to some of the challenges, it may just simply be a case of knowledge mobilization and getting uptake and scaling and spreading those solutions rather than sort of developing new ones. And so we had these big group of collaborators. This, as I say, we brought them together, but we also shared the survey on social media and asked people to sort of pass it on to other colleagues who might be interested. And for each section, we asked people to give us their top 3 important challenges. And that could relate to offering, accepting, or processing financial or non-financial compensation or remuneration or recognition. And so we had 176 respondents to this first Delphi, of which we had 496 comments received around financial compensation or remuneration. We had just under 400, so 376 for non-financial or recognition, 350 there or thereabouts for reimbursement. And we were able to condense this into 74 unique challenges. Notably, some of the challenges cut across these sort of key domains, and so we actually collapsed those. So things like it takes a long time to process, whether it's reimbursement or remuneration, for example. So we actually collapsed those different areas. And what we ended up was grouping those 74 challenges into 10 key headings, which again, from what we've seen already, are not necessarily surprising. So institutional processes and procedures were the biggest group. We also had issues in terms of funding and funders, tax issues and the Canada Revenue Agency, guidance and guidelines, authorship challenges, inequities and unique situations, so whether the specific considerations for certain populations or in certain contexts, conflicts and biases, how to match recognition to the contribution that's being made, education and awareness, and then also a number of issues that related to patient partner burden in the process. And so for the second and third rounds, we actually asked people to rate the importance of each of these 74 items and also say how difficult it would be to address these. So these were all rated on a 1 to 9 scale, where 9 was critically important or very difficult. And based on the 176 respondents to round 1, we had 144 people who provided their email address, indicating a willingness to participate in the second and third round of the survey. And I'm not going to go through each round individually, but just to say that in the final round, we had 94 respondents, half of which were people with lived experience and about a quarter were researchers. And we had representation from all the provinces plus the Yukon, and about 40% of respondents were from Ontario. When we look at the results, what we found was we had 11 challenges that were rated as high priority and easy to address in the final round. We didn't have any that were deemed to be unimportant, and we had 7 challenges that were identified as being very important, but difficult to address. And I'll just note here that of those 7, the majority were related to sort of tax and Canada Revenue Agency and those bigger structural issues, and actually were, in terms of their median rating, in terms of importance, were the highest rated items, but because of their difficulty were not our focus of immediate concern. It was these that were perhaps easier to address. That's our immediate concern. So briefly, you can see here what was covered. Institutional processes, education and awareness, funder and funding, and academic recognition. Again, lots of overlap in terms of understanding when or how to provide different forms of recognition of remuneration, how to think about this, budget for it, and so forth. So very similar to some of the challenges we see, but maybe in a bit more granularity. So what's needed and where do we need to go from here? My perspective, others may have their own thoughts of what's most important, but from my perspective, despite available guidance documents, we have those 65 guidance documents, there seems to be this issue that a lack of guidance or knowledge is commonly cited. So that seems to suggest a disconnect between the available guidance documents and actually what's happening on the ground, what's happening in practice. And that might be an implementation challenge. So why are these not happening? And when we think back to that survey of investigators that we looked at, there seemed to be this disconnect between their perceived ability to provide compensation. So we need to understand that gap better between the guidance and use, and then develop tools to address those barriers. We also see ongoing comments about remuneration, right? Grant finances, and I know there's some steps being taken forward here in terms of some organisations such as the Ontario Sport Support Unit providing small grants that will support remuneration of patient partners absent any larger project grants. And then we also have those systemic barriers, those structural issues such as taxation and the impact on patient partnership remuneration, which will require bigger projects and work going forward. So I mentioned in that very brief timeline for the CARES project, we actually did have a 2-day hybrid meeting. As part of that, we actually tried to think through some potential solutions to some of the challenges we'd identified. And one of the topics that came out was sort of decision aid or decision support tool, which actually would tackle a number of those education and awareness topics, as well as the institutional processes that were identified. So again, you can imagine that we would have different remuneration or recognition options listed in some sort of tool. You'd have something like frequently asked questions or sort of key issues that would go across, and you'd have those listed for each of the different recognition options. And so people would be able to have a conversation. There'd be information about that. People could make informed choices about what those options would be. And also it might help address that discomfort of researchers in actually discussing these issues, given they have a tool to support that conversation. And that was something we've built into a grant that's under consideration at the minute. The other area I think we need to look at is actually empirical evidence for some of the practices and the topics of discussion that we've had. So as I mentioned, there's these discussion about equity, about whether remuneration, particularly and reimbursement, sort of facilitate engagement, facilitate broader and more diverse groups to be engaged. But we actually lack empirical evidence about how we do this, what sort of context it works. Are there different thresholds of amounts that lead to change, lead to improved engagement? We often don't disentangle reimbursement and remuneration, actually, in some of the work that's reported, and we certainly lack comparative studies on different engagement and recognition and compensation options. So there's a need for more empirical work in this space. So I'm going to end with some sources of support and assistance. I'll not go over too many, but just to highlight a couple, given that much of the work certainly that I support is seeking funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, I often direct people to their website, and particularly the Institute of Musculoskeletal Health and Arthritis, as well as the Institute of Genetics, both of which have a number of resources about patient engagement and compensation guidelines. Given that the funder is often CHR, I tend to sort of go to funding that's from a CHR institute in terms of setting my guidance. But obviously there are a number of other resources. And then a very practical tool from the University of Manitoba and their Centre for Healthcare Innovation is this budget builder that they have. And this is a pre-formulated, basically an Excel file, which has a number of key questions that relate to budgeting for patient engagement. And you can basically plug in the numbers and it helps you build your budget. So again, very practical tool for thinking through and working out what your patient engagement budget would be in a grant application. Finally, the Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium has a number of patient engagement resources. There's a couple of documents they've put together, some of which include compensation, remuneration, and recognition. There is also a webinar conducted by Maureen Smith and Andrea Chow, which talks about patient engagement in the grant application. So one of those pieces about thinking through that process, including how you recognize patient partners and having them as co-applicants. We also did a recent webinar about knowledge mobilization, which talks about a number of different ways of engaging in co-production of results and dissemination, including conference presentations and things to bear in mind there. So also another good resource for thinking through some of these topics. So just left for me to acknowledge all my collaborators and co-authors and colleagues. I'm just here presenting the work that was done by a group of several teams, including the work led by Grace Fox as a master's thesis, supervised by Dean Ferguson, Manoj Laloo, and where Maureen Smith and Dawn Stacey were on the thesis advisory committee. The work from Monica Talliard's group around pragmatic trials that was part of that trialist survey, as well as the CARES project, which was co-led by two patient partners, Dawn Richards and Laurie Prue, along with Manoj Laloo and Dean Ferguson again. I also need to thank our funders, CHR, for the project grant that supported the pragmatic trials work, the planning grant, which supported some of the CARES work, and the Ontario Sports Support and an Empower Award, which has supported the dissemination and ongoing production of results for that work. So thank you to those and all those attendees to the CARES work and everyone who completed our surveys. So thank you very much, and I can stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for presenting all the amazing findings from both the that thesis work and the CARES project, and really, really interesting stuff coming out of that. Um, the um, the barriers that you noted in terms of the the those survey respondents on fixed income, for instance, that's certainly a big challenge, and one that I think you noted, really well in terms of, having those one-on-one conversations with patient partners is so important to be able to understand, where they're at, what their needs are, and finding um, a way to remunerate or to reimburse that works for them. And often we've heard in projects as well that that's really a key thing, because the last thing you want is to provide funding to somebody that then it means that their government funding is getting clawed back, or something like that. So having those conversations is super important. So thank you so much for raising that issue in particular. Just before so certainly, if anyone has questions, please add them in the chat. But just while we're waiting for those to roll in, there was a question early on about whether the recording of this webinar would be available in French, or would we be able to share the slide deck and that kind of thing. So we just noted in the Q&A that the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll get this kind of finalized and post it there in the next few days. And there will be subtitles in French. And if people have other languages that they need, then that will be facilitated kind of through the YouTube experience there. And then we'll certainly, once the link is ready, we'll share that on our social media and in our newsletter coming up. And so please look for that in the post-production phase there. But I do see a question from Kathy. So she just says, great presentation. I'd like to suggest another R word, which is regroup. By this, I mean understanding at the get-go supports that patient partners may need to fully participate, i.e. training on jargon, for instance, methodology and scope, and ensuring remuneration for these steps as well. So just wanted to share that with you, and feel free to respond to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that those are key things that need to be discussed at the outset. I guess I wouldn't have necessarily put them in those domains that I was talking about, but certainly, we talked about at the start when I talked through reimbursement. I guess we could sort of take it out of reimbursement in terms of proactively thinking. So it isn't reimbursement, it's actually proactively given in the first place. So yeah, I completely understand that these are things that need to be discussed. And so, yeah, if it is available and people have the ability to provide those up front, I agree having conversations. And, it's part of what we do in our consultations when we're even first trying to match, if we have sort of patient partners coming to be matched with projects and look at whether it's a good fit, we would often bring those things into that conversation early on. So yeah, if you can provide those early on, I would obviously strongly support that, recognizing the challenges that were also mentioned in terms of not having funding at that stage. So I think there needs to be like you say, the conversation and sort of figure out the best way forward with those.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Another question in the chat from Chris Johnston. I wonder if the guidance gap is partially due to organizations not formally adopting any particular process or policy, leaving individual researchers in uncertainty. Would it be worth? I think it got cut off there, but maybe just if you could speak to that first part of that question there.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised if this is an issue that individuals or even organizations don't really know which ones to adopt. We've seen changes. This is always a moving field. So, for example, in some of the documents that are a few years older now, there were recommendations that if you were to work on an hourly rate, it was $25 an hour. Some of the newer guidance has updated that to $40 an hour equivalent. So again, understanding when and how we should adopt or look to different guidance and which ones we should choose is always going to be a challenge. I think it's from an institutional perspective, having policies that sort of explicitly adopt one can be a challenge, particularly when you've got things like trainees and groups that don't have amounts. So you'd have to have some sort of flexibility, I think, in terms of that. If you don't have funding, how do you provide that? So working through that. Our own policy is to recommend this and sort of point to some examples, but we don't actually have our own compensation policy here. But absolutely, I think it does maybe lead to some challenges. And if we could certainly look at harmonization, I don't know whether we'd get a single endorsement of a single consensus, given that organizations may have different kind of mandates. But I do think, for example, if CHR across its institutes could harmonize things, I think the CHR Institute of Genetics and Musculoskeletal Health are pretty similar, if not identical. So yeah, I think some degree of harmonization would be good and would facilitate the adoption, but it would also require things that, like the processes and the practicalities of processing payments and those sorts of things, which are not really covered at that CHR level, right? It doesn't go into that level of detail. So there still requires that step of how do we actually implement this more general guidance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And thanks, Chris, for resending that last part. And actually, Stuart, you addressed it in the last part of your answer there. So thanks so much. In the Q&A, one question was, do you have data on patient partners who have experience of disability?
I don't actually have data on that, I'm afraid. I think it's a great question. Accessibility and disability are often things that are not picked up in some of the discussions, and certainly I've been in conversations where that's been flagged as a missing element when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and making sure accessibility and disability related aspects are included in that. But I don't have any data, I'm afraid, on that.
Okay. And then just as a follow-up to that, are there accommodations paid by the participants, i.e. sign language, note-taking, etc.?
Again, I would hope that these are conversations that mean that they're not paid and reimbursed. We try to be proactive. So again, going back to Kathy's point, trying to have those conversations early on to make sure they're not paid out of pocket. We've certainly tried to do that. Some individuals will have accessibility devices like screen readers and things like that they would have outside of a specific project. So in that case, we sometimes have a conversation about if there's an ongoing cost to that, can we pay a proportion of that for our project?
And we might have, I think we have time for one more question, and there's one here from Deborah. She's saying there are standardized procedures for researchers. Here's a silly question though. What processes or definitions, communication standards, sorry, that is patient-facing, exist for organizations? We usually find out after the fact.
If I'm right interpreting the question, if this is about the sort of communication of standards for reimbursement, I don't think those are often public facing for institutions. So like our process for processing payments at the Ottawa Hospital isn't a public document. We have an internal set of SOPs and things like that. So I think we can definitely do more in terms of communicating that information, but I don't know from an institutional perspective whether that's something they would want to have as a public, given the processes are internal. And so yeah, I think that's generally an internal document, but certainly the network organizations have their guidelines public.
Great. Okay. That's great. And thanks, Claudia, for sharing the resource. It's pwlepeerreview.ca. Great short module for PWLEs interested in participating in peer review as a patient partner. Okay, so thank you so much, Stuart, for the amazing webinar today. And just a reminder that we have our next webinar coming up January 28th. So we'll be circulating that. And for the fellows that are on the line, so the trainees, please stay on the line, and we'll be opening up a small group chat for the trainees here as we wrap up. So thank you everyone for attending today, and look forward to continuing the conversation online and circulating webinar. Feel free to share that with anyone that wasn't able to make it today. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.